All right, so with that said, we're going to jump into our first session. So this is actually our session with myself and Cody. Cody, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so Cody Mathis, software engineer here at Patch My PC. Been working with Configuration Manager and WSUS for a fair while now, I guess. It's almost been 10 years, and more WSUS lately than I ever thought I would work with. So a lot of interaction with some weird, crazy WSUS stuff just because of the position I'm in, and really have enjoyed being able to present at vSmug. It was pretty cool that we started this.
Awesome. It looks like we do have Meghan Stewart as well. So Meghan, are you on and able to come up and mute?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Meghan Stewart. I work for Microsoft. I worked in CSS doing software updates for, I don't know, about 7 years. And I've been writing the docs for Configuration Manager for the past like 3 or 4.
Awesome. So Meghan's kind of a surprise guest. She wasn't actually in the original agenda. So we're super excited to have her on. So Meghan, from a Microsoft kind of support perspective, she's kind of the go-to, or was the go-to, for WSUS issues. So what I asked Meghan to do just before we kind of jump into some of our tips is to give a little background on when she started seeing these WSUS issues start, and just really anything that you want to share, Meghan, around, when that happened, how you were finding out the root of the issues, how the indexing came about. So really anything that you want to share, you can share your screen if you want, or just talk, totally up to you.
Yeah, we'll just talk. I actually have some notes that I dug out through my email going, when did this stuff actually start? It seems like it's been forever. So do a little history lesson. So throughout the years, we've seen like a few WSUS perf cases, specifically with like IECUs and like with long supersedence change, and occasionally ones caused by excessive like FEP and SCEP definitions in this SDB. However, these issues were pretty isolated, and they were usually accompanied by excessive resource util and the Windows Update agent on clients as well. From a Microsoft perspective, what we would do is we would break an Internet Explorer cumulative update supersedence chain and clean up the definitions, call it a day. At this time, CM admins were really kind of hands-off with WSUS. We basically installed it, closed the WSUS config wizard, and forgot about it, right? It was just sitting in the background unless there was some sort of like little issue with an IECU or too many SCEP defs. We didn't touch it. So the WSUS perf problems that pretty much everybody's familiar with started really ramping up around the June-July timeframe of 2015. So we're going pretty way back. This was about the time that Windows 10 15.07 launched, and we started actually even seeing inklings of these issues earlier than the Windows 10 releases. At this point in time, you guys may remember most of the patches were shipped individually. We really didn't see a ton of cumulative updates for operating systems. Occasionally, Windows team would ship out a roll-up like for Windows 7 that you could import into WSUS and install. But for the most part, basically you had like 12 individual KBs that needed to be installed for each machine. We really started to realize that something was kind of going on when a handful of like very large customers started reporting issues with scanning and compliance. And these customers, we knew them really well. We had great working relationships with them. And what they were really seeing in the IIS logs for WSUS servers, they kind of started out with 503s, shifted to 500s. And if it got really bad, sometimes you'd see like really unusual WSUS errors for WSUS, like 400s. It's like, what? I've never seen WSUS IIS throw 400s. So we were trying to figure out what is causing this. A lot of the times, we were like, well, it's kind of like what we see with the Internet Explorer CUs that I talked about before. So we did a little bit of cleanup, and that didn't quite solve the issue. So what we basically found was the CM agent, when it calls the Windows Update agent to scan to WSUS, it actually includes a directive to scan against superseded updates. Because we want all that reporting data, right? CM admins totally are into reporting data. CM also has like a 30-minute scan retry. You your scan fails on your client, 30 minutes later, it tries again. And in some cases, it was actually 30 seconds, but that was kind of rare. A flat WSUS scan, it really didn't do this. It kind of just directed the Windows Update agent to prune out potentially superseded updates. The client's Windows Update agent just didn't really do a good job of this, but it did help a little bit. It also didn't retry scan every 30 minutes. So this is why we kind of didn't see these issues in just WSUS only environments, but we saw them limited to CM environments. So we kind of figured out what was going on. And we're like, you know what, hey, since we're actually including a directive to scan against these, if we decline these, it lessens the load on the client and the WSUS server as a whole. By this point, it was probably like, 6 months later, out comes a blog. Hey, you guys, this is how you actually fix this issue. What we would do at that point is eventually we would find like additional little settings that would help the performance of WSUS scans, like settings for .NET, changing bits in the with each other, with other engineers, and with our customers. So seemed to resolve the issue until about 2017. So I told you this was going to be a history lesson, guys. So, about 2017, those large customers started having issues again. At this time, the SSDB was pretty much as clean as we could make it. Superseded updates were completely declined and in some cases deleted, but that's a story for another day. It was optimized as we could get them, and they still had issues. So around here, we learned that we could kind of fake a cache for WSUS scanned. It seemed to kind of work well, but the issue still was around, even with that. So one of our escalation engineers, Larry, he spent a ton of time just kind of debugging what was going on. What he found was basically that when WSUS was expanding this metadata, which is basically your applicability rules for why, if an update's actually installable by a client, there was like a cap of 4K, where it was basically, okay, we'd unspool about 4K of this stuff, stick it in a buffer. If that wasn't big enough, hey, you know what? Let's just double it, right? So let's double it to 8K. So during this time, we're still releasing CUs for Windows 10, and we're still releasing, a whole bunch of little tiny KBs. And what we kind of realized was, hey, when we look at the metadata for a Windows 10 device, we'd see that the metadata was something like 90 megs, sometimes it even go even higher. So versus like Windows 2003, I think it was like a few hundred K at most, right? Because basically it was only looking for something like a reg key or, a file version, and that was it. So imagine taking this 90 meg file, going, oh, bigger than 4K, let's go to 8. Oh, bigger than 8K. So doing that over and over again for 90 meg, right? So what Larry found out was, hey, you know what? We should definitely increase that limit. So that's basically the WSUS fix that came out. That's the one that everybody wants to install. You know what? You don't even have to worry about installing it pretty much anymore unless you're running like a 2012 server.
We might have lost you, Megan. Are you still there? Oh, there we go. I can hear you.
Sorry.
No worries. Go ahead.
So at this point, I mean, that was really kind of the whole crux of the issue. 2 years later, we find this teeny tiny little setting, and that was the majority of the problem. Not meaning that you shouldn't keep your WSUS clean. You really should. I mean, even when you have any other database, you want to do maintenance on it. Same thing goes for WSUS. So originally, that old guidance, hey, install WSUS and forget about it. Don't do that, as we all know. So there you go. History lesson. Any questions?
What was the one setting that you were talking about? I'm not sure if we might have lost you a couple of seconds before
Sure,
that.
It was if you're talking about the kind of like the 4K buffer, That was actually setting in the code. It was nothing that you could change. It was a hard coded limit.
Okay.
Yeah. So
and that's that performance hot fix. Yep. Okay.
it is. And ever since then, you know, I mean, we still have issues. We still see issues. And as new admins come in, you know, they get, actually, I don't think my blog's still out there anymore. It's actually been folded into the docs. It's like, hey, here, go maintain your WSUS. Go do these fixes.
Yeah.
Any questions on kind of the history?
Yeah. So any questions, go ahead and put it in the chat, or if you've raised hand, we can probably do a couple questions and then we'll jump into kind of the demo that me and Cody have. But we do have some time if anyone wants to raise hand and come off on mute, or if you just want to ask a question in the chat. Okay, so is the 4K limit still around, or has that been addressed now for new installs?
So I remember actually testing the private. Like I said, I went through my emails for this history lesson. I was testing that private fix around August 2017, and it was released soon after that.
A little confused by that question. Any plans to use the MS catalog directly?
So the catalog itself, and this is where some people kind of get a little confused. The catalog is not Windows Update. So like, if it's actually kind of a separate entity. So when, say like your home computer, you're just scanning against just regular old Microsoft Update, that's actually separate from the catalog, and things are published into Windows Update that might not be in the catalog. So that catalog is there specifically for WSUS to sync its updates from. Well, and then, you know, to grab an MSU file if you need it. So I don't know about using the catalog directly because WSUS kind of already really does that.
If you have the link handy, Megan, for that hot fix, like just in case it is an older version, do you have like the KB for that patch anywhere we could paste in maybe the chat window?
Yeah, you know what? I remember when I wrote the docs for it, so I was like, let's make sure we put those in there. I'll have to dig it out, but yeah, I can get that for you.
Perfect. Okay, let's, any other questions? Maybe Megan can kind of monitor the chat and answer there as well. I don't see any right now. So at this point, Cody and I will kind of jump into the demo with some of those optimizations and some statistics that we've seen just with all the customers that we have. So let's go ahead and jump into that. So for a little background, where we were able to pull some data is, so Patch My PC, you know, where we both work, we have about 3,400 customer environments. And what we actually detected is we implemented the ability for us to understand if optimizations for WSUS were actually enabled. So let me pull up kind of this guide and we'll dig into this a bit more. Let's see if I can open that up.
They are links, but whether or not it's going to open nicely for you.
That's a good question. There we go. Cool. So a little background, Cody, maybe you could kind of cover these three things that we're looking at here.
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, we did implement some telemetry, as he mentioned, and these are, and we'll go into detail later, but at a high level, right, these are some checkboxes that are within Configuration Manager, right? The product team implemented these kind of piecemeal over time, and they're three awesome checkboxes. I think now, at least one of them is checked by default. I forget offhand, but we'll go into what each of them does. We started collecting telemetry, right? And that telemetry has helped us to get some insight into, well, how valuable they are. And I'm sure Microsoft probably has some similar information, but we got some really high level info. Hey, are they enabled or not? And we've got a little bit of error telemetry to kind of coincide with them. We reach out to customers regarding that. And so as part of that here, Justin's got some details on how we communicated to customers.
Yeah, so basically what happened here is we went from basically, you know, around the same time frames that Megan was having issues, 2017 is when we started having customers have sync. So we, once we implemented this proactive care where we started notifying customers about these Microsoft fixes, we essentially went from 3,000 customers that had no timeout issues around WSUS the last time that they synchronized. So pretty crazy, just with some basic checkboxes and a little bit of due diligence, like the level of performance and not having any issues with WSUS. Cool. So SQL memory. So a couple things to be aware of for your WSUS database. So there's a few different areas that WSUS can run on. You can use the Windows internal database. So if you use WID, this is generally, I would say, not recommended, but there are use cases for using WID just to keep it simple. Maybe you have a remote SUP in a DMZ and it's just a bit more complex to get a SQL instance. But if you're using WID, there's not going to be any SQL memory limit that you need to configure. It's set to unlimited by default. Now, one thing that we did notice for customers that were having timeouts in WSUS perf, oftentimes it could be due to low SQL memory limits in SQL Server. So to show you what that actually looks like, one thing that we would recommend checking, let me just log in here to our server.
Yeah, so with the WID being unlimited, right, that's largely not going to be a problem. But if that WID is sitting on a box like your site server, maybe it is a little busy, you might want to consider either using SQL and putting some limits, or you can get into WID and adjust memory limits as well if you find that unlimited memory bit is actually a problem.
All right, so we'll just jump in here and kind of show you where that's configured. So one thing that we did notice is when we were seeing timeouts, it was often a combination of low spec memory. So for example, 8 gigs, not bad, but it wasn't uncommon for us to see some customers that were running WSUS on a very limited server. And sometimes we would see like 1 gig or 2 gig, kind of the max memory that SQL could use. So just something to kind of factor in as you're checking your checkboxes of, how do we make sure WSUS is optimized? You want to have a reasonable amount there for the limit that it has enough memory usage. Okay.
Awesome. Yeah, so the next big component, and I almost was going to cross off the 10 and just make it 1 instead of 10, because this is honestly the biggest one. Creating custom indexes. In all of our testing that we've been doing, the custom indexes, which we'll dig into here, is probably the biggest impact that we have seen when it comes to performance and preventing timeouts, just end to end. It works great. So if you are using WSUS alongside Configuration Manager, this highlighted checkbox on the right, this will do the indexes. It'll create the indexes for you. Now, there are some kind of it depends marks here, right? You have to have permission. If you have a WID and it's on your site server, not terribly uncommon. It's going to have permission by default because it's going to be the tasks are going to be running a system. System will have access to the WID. If you have a WID remote from the site server, it is not possible, and some of these maintenance actions will fail. These maintenance tasks specifically is the not possible part. The docs are pretty explicit about what will and will not work, but I can say for sure the indexing will not get created in that scenario. And SQL, yeah, for sure. I mean, assuming you've got permissions in place, which you likely do, if you've got remote SQL or local SQL, you'll be able to have these actually get created. Now, in the event that you can't create these indexes, MS provides docs, and this is likely what Meghan was referencing, or part of it, because I know in the past year or two, I don't know, time flies, those docs got incredibly good. So we'll dig into how to create them manually as well, and actually reference those queries a little bit to get some info. And something that I'll kind of show as well, we do have a chicken and egg scenario here, right? So there's a lot of environments that are kind of ill-maintained because of the set it and forget it mentality that we've all had ingrained in us. And the maintenance happens after a sync. And there are certain scenarios where a sync will fail and all of the maintenance never actually runs, right? And likely adding the indexes would let the sync finish properly, but it never happens, right? So, which is not great. You want things to work. So what I'm going to show, let me pop over. He's got that create custom indexes, which looks super pretty in a PowerShell or a slide. Let's show it over here. Nope, that's not what I want to click. Demo 1. You stole it from me. Just reasonably sized.
Yeah, that looks pretty good.
Awesome. So first I want to show this component. So that WSUS maintenance that we were looking at, right? We've got the declining updates. We've got add non-clustered. This is where this is all configured. So this is where you want to check and see if you do have these set up. Now, what does this add non-clustered indexes actually do? So in the docs, they have a query that they will show you, and it looks like this. And you can see it's creating a couple of indexes, right? So I mean, I'll go ahead and switch over to the actual correct database, and I'll execute these. And it looks like I already have them, right? It already exists on table, so it's synced and it's already happens. Now, why these are important though? Because you always see like just do it, just turn them on. Well, what the heck is going on? So this one in particular, we'll kind of dig in here. We've got TB revision supersedes updates. So this, one of the actions that happens when you do a sync is this stored procedure right here. Exec SP search updates. And you can actually provide this a parameter of XML update scope XML, and you can get very, hyper specific on what it does, but this can take quite a while to run, especially if you have a lot of updates, which we do in here. Actually, we've got quite a few updates. And so this will just sit here and it'll kind of hang out. It'll take forever. Now, if we go into this stored procedure, SP search updates, modify, that's fine. So in particular, we've got this view for minimal updates. This view actually is where we're catching a lot of our revision info, and that revision info without these indexes can be very, 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 very slow. So if I actually look at these tables, you can see the indexes. So I can pull up TB revision supersedence, and I can see an index right here, right? These are what are getting created. And it actually shows you, the data type and whatever, and you actually have the index name. As you can see, it's our non-clustered ones. So these are actually what's getting created in order to make lookups faster, right? And without these queries, such as exec SP search updates, are querying tables that reference these lookups, and they don't have indexes, and they get very, very, very slow. Right? And the same thing kind of happens with some localization. So localization, so if you have multiple languages, the titles and descriptions and things like that, there's no good index, no good non-clustered index in place until those actually get ran, right? So without all of that in place, you get really slow queries, and you can start actually seeing timeouts. Now, we do have a good run. We can actually see here, it worked. And our sync finished. So sync starting, sync updates after, and then after it all finishes, everything's happy. Then it actually does the indexing and it does all of the cleanup. But this is because things actually happened successfully. And aside from that, I think we actually have a timeout. Might address that later. Do you want to show running? Kind of talk about running the indexes, Justin? I think we've got a slide.
Yeah, let me pull that back up. Yeah, and we'll have some demos of the timeouts that can occur as well, like when the indexes aren't made. But as far as the indexing goes, there is some scenarios. So we have the custom indexes, which is what Cody just talked about. And then we have actual reindexing of the database. So before we actually jump into reindexing of the database, let me see if we can pull up a sync that actually timed out. So if we come in here and kind of look at the WSync manager log, this is actually an instance of, actually I might not be at the wrong snapshot. We'll come back to this, but we're currently running this for, do you know how long that search updates took on the demo one that you were just running on, Cody? Is that completed now?
I'm gonna go look. So that one took about, it says 3.5 minutes right now.
Okay, cool. So we'll come back to that, but one additional factor that can be pretty important that a lot of config-man admins may not do by default is actual reindexing of the database. So there's a couple of ways that you can do this, but we're going to go through and kind of show one of the most simple methods, which would be to use the SQL Server agent and create a maintenance plan. So what I'm going to do here is by default, the SQL Server agent can be used to like run task. So this may not be auto start by default. So if I just jump into services, just one thing that you might have to account for, if we look at SQL Server agent, there we go. No, that's SMS agent, SQL Server agent. There we go. We're just going to set that to automatic, delayed, and then start that up. So in the Microsoft Docs, and one thing to note is if you go to vsmug.com, so virtual system management user group.com/GitHub, a lot of these SQL queries that we have are going to be in this month's user group folder. So 12/21, and then we have the SQL scripts. So we have a variety of queries that we're going to be showing you here that we can use. So just be aware that this is there. So this is directly from the Microsoft Docs, but what we can do is make sure that there's actually a job running. So if I come under management, and was it maintenance plans, Cody? Right.
Yeah. So maintenance plans, we'll do a new maintenance plan. Again, a lot of ways to do this. This is the super basic one. They cover it in the docs. It's totally functional. Somebody actually asked the question, reindexing with Ola Hollengren's is always suggested for CM. Is that applicable? Absolutely, right? So if you already have Ola Hollengren's maintenance plans in place, it by default, if you just kind of follow like Steve Thompson's guide or something else, it's going to do all user databases. It's going to already likely be reindexing your SUSDB. So yeah, go for it, right? There's nothing wrong with that. And if you have a DBA team, it's kind of a weird gray area. A lot of CM admins seem to hate giving access to the DBAs to CM. Sometimes there's actually a security concern for it. But if you've got DBAs and they do maintain this, likely this might already be done, as well. There's probably already some reindexing. So he's just setting up a super basic maintenance plan, right? Right click, new maintenance plan, give it a name, give it a schedule. I think the Doc's official recommendation is to put the maintenance probably after a cleanup, right? So realistically, once you kind of poke the database a bunch is when you probably want to do a reindexing. You want to reconfigure and check those indexes. But yeah, I mean, aside from that, this group drag an item out of the tech box. You have to click the plan, I think. Maintenance plans task. You got to expand it.
There we go.
Yeah, cool. So we've got a maintenance plan up, and then we're just going to grab execute T-SQL statement, pop it over there, and then we're going to go ahead and just put in the SQL from the MS Docs. Totally. Do you let? Yeah, that's totally a good question, Andrew.
Yep. So we'll basically just put in that exact reindex script from the docs, click OK, and then save. So right now this plan is configured to run weekly. So that's probably fine. So every Sunday, we have a schedule set up, and what that's essentially going to do is just make sure that the WSUS database gets reindexed every week. Cool. All right. Yeah, I think that's it as far as the reindexing goes.
Yeah, it's not the most exciting topic, but I think the big call out there is the top line there. Creating the indexes is a one-off operation, right? There's two things going on. Step one is creating the indexes. The maintenance is going to do it for you. In ConfigMan, you can do it yourself. It's a WID, certain scenarios. It's on demo 2, by the way, the timeout, Justin. It's a snapshot there. But the reindexing, that's an ongoing operation. That's something you need to continue to do. Let's see.
All right, so decline unneeded updates. Let me go ahead and boot this up. Start
Yeah.
that.
So for declining unneeded updates, this is kind of an interesting one, and we went back and forth on a couple parts of this and actually confirmed / learned something. But a big takeaway right up top, clients scan against all non-declined updates in WSUS. So the more ill-maintained and or older your WSUS environment is, you likely have a lot of non-declined updates that you may not need. So the more updates you have, the more updates you're going to scan against, and that will go deeper into that as we go here. So there was a question, declining superseded, are there any concerns, etc. Oh no, I've lost my slide. Somebody actually asked in the questions, are there any concerns about declining superseded updates? I mean, it depends. Generally, it's superseded. You'd likely have the newer update unless you've gone out of your way to retain the superseded and decline the newer. I mean, superseded means it's superseded, right? The superseding update should contain the actual content. So yeah, it depends. I've seen Qualys and other scanners start flagging the old updates and say you need this. But generally, I mean, there's a reason supersedence exists. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on with regards to like what you have selected and the impact it can have, right? We've got a really quick snippet here where we did an initial sync of the products and we just selected Windows, all of Windows, and it took 10 hours, which is a while, right? That's a long time. It's just an initial sync, but it took a while. And if you start to get rid of products and, get rid of decline stuff that's old, you're going to start to see this go way down and have a smaller catalog. But in particular, I think what's interesting here is this catalog, the metadata, what's declined, like why should I be doing this? What can I actually see? So let me pop demo 1 over. Many. Here we go. Apply a snapshot, and I'm going to share. Stopping, starting, saved, apply, start. Awesome. Yeah, so I did see that David James asked a question about Ola script a little bit ago there. Like, what are people doing with, where are they putting their Ola Hollengren like maintenance logs? Because one of the options is to store the output in a log, and whether that's a database or its own database, I think it can go to master. It can just be files. It can be both. And there's some licensing concerns in some cases, right? If you create a whole new database, you could actually violate your license that you have for the config manager for the software update point. For the SQL license. Awesome. So just got this reset. Let's pull up SQL Server Management Studio. Got a couple queries I want to show. So while this loads up, Meghan actually talked about it a little bit, right? We've got the metadata for these updates, and that's kind of what you're downloading and processing, and it's what's caused a lot of headaches. And there is some kind of specific queries you can do to get some interesting info about those updates. So a couple things I'll pull up here on my side. Just wait for SQL Server Management Studio while I do that. Let's see here. This one. Open SQL Server Management Studio. I knew I clicked it. Oh yeah, we are still waiting.
It's not the fastest app.
No. I did it in Java. Awesome. So I'm going to do some new queries here on the SUSDB. So we're talking about getting rid of updates. This thing's kind of in an ugly state. Right now, I have 17,000 superseded non-declined updates, which is like super bad. I mean, that's really bad, right? Clients are going to scan against those. And what's interesting about that too, actually snag this from a TC Smug. There's some interesting info about these updates, right? You actually have metadata size for these updates. So this is the metadata. It's the applicability rules, title, description. It's a bunch of bits and pieces, but it's what your client has to download and then kind of process and figure out. So this is in bytes, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, kind of small, right? But 913,000 rows, you know, so there's a lot of metadata that starts to get added up. And so what I actually did was snagged the sum of all of our metadata. But I can't type. Where did I mess it up? Where? No, I don't want to where. I didn't grab the whole query. There we go. 260 megs, right? So raw in the database, roughly, we're looking at about 260 megabytes of metadata for non-declined updates, which is a lot. And you may not download the whole 260 megabytes, right? Because there's probably going to be some XML compression as it goes over the wire. But you can start to use some of these queries that we'll end up sharing out to pinpoint, right, like bad categories. For example, SharePoint, right? Believe it or not, I don't have SharePoint in this demo environment. So you want to decline them. And they're not necessarily superseded. So realistically, you're not even actually going to get them cleaned up with maintenance tasks, right? Not default stuff anyway. If I come into my site components, software update point, I've got options around maintenance. Okay, decline expired. Well, it's not expired. Remove obsolete. Well, okay, I mean, it's SharePoint 2010, but it's technically not obsolete. And then I've got supersedence rules. Even if I drop this to 1 or 0 immediately, these aren't superseded. They're totally valid updates. So a couple ways, super easy way, if you just identify a high-level product, you can come into WSUS, do the thing you shouldn't do, come in here, expand, find all updates, and then I can actually say updates are for a specific product, you know, with this new update view. I didn't even know this existed. I always do PowerShell, and Justin's like, do this. I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Come in here, and maybe I just decommed my Office communicator servers, and we recently decommed XP for, you know, Office, and I could go find these things and start to, or I'm doing the inverse of what I should do. Find the ones that you want to find, add them into the view, and then you can come in here and you can just decline, right? Select them, decline them. You're going to end up cleaning out your database, less updates, smaller metadata, shorter scans, less resource intense. That's really what it boils down to. You want to reduce the amount of updates.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that Cody was mentioning there is, you know, kind of the scenario would be maybe you had Windows XP selected in your software update point in ConfigMan, and then you unchecked it. That product and those updates will still exist in WSUS for clients to scan against until you actually go in and decline it. And that's where those search criteria can be quite helpful, to just go kind of one-time decline everything that you kind of cleaned up. And that kind of leads into the next piece, which would be, let me share this out, which is actually reviewing those products that you have enabled. So for example, when we had some customers that often had the timeout syncs, we would see oftentimes it would be like all Windows, all Microsoft products enabled from the group level. And this especially became problematic when the WSUS custom indexes weren't in place that made the queries quicker when the software update point was syncing from WSUS. That's where we'd see these timeouts. But the other thing that can be impacted, like if you do have like Windows XP, for example, that's been end of life for quite some time now. Well, when we were talking about that metadata, you know, 256 megabytes of metadata was what the entire catalog being selected. That's what Cody was showing in that scan. What that also impacts is the actual client side. So the first scan is from a client that had pretty much the full catalog enabled. So on the client side, we can see it had just about that same size that was actually in the WSUS database on the client's datastore.ebd file. So this is the actual local scan of the updates against WSUS. So this is where it stores it. Now, what we have kind of on the next one, this is kind of a maintained. This is has the superseded updates being declined. This also had a reasonable number of products like Windows 10, basically anything newer than Windows 7. And this was what the client side actually looked like for the scanning when we actually had a maintained catalog. And we also kind of limited our scope of products that we were enabled. So if I jump back over to our demo here, let me jump over to hide that. So this is on the server side. This is actually what it looked like running that same query that Cody had for a catalog that has been maintained and a list of products that were pretty reasonable. So if I come in here and look at my software update point, and look at the products, we have a pretty reasonable list of, Windows 10, kind of newer products within the environment, right? So Defender, we have Windows 10, Windows 7, Windows 8. So still, reasonable number of products here, but it really reduced that catalog size. Now, one thing, let me jump over here that we had, if we look at demo 3, this was the timeouts that we were seeing in ConfigMan when the custom indexes weren't created. So if I go up to minimize that. Thought this was the one. Let's see.
According to the snapshot notes, you have it on demo 2. Did you revert to the? Oh yeah, the operation is time. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so this is what we would see when the custom indexes that really improved that query time that we saw were not enabled. And things like memory SQL utilization was set to a pretty low amount. This is where we get that chicken and egg problem where the actual sync of updates never completes, because when Config Manager goes and queries WSUS using that search updates API, if it takes longer than 150 seconds, that's where you'll see these timeouts occur in your WSync Manager log. So this is kind of what we were seeing on the customer side of things when this was happening. Now, for example, I just ran the search indexes. This is one that did not have it. And that query, when we had a lot of products enabled, on this machine right here, it just took about 5 minutes and 50 seconds. Now, let me see if we'll see if we can do this in real time. So we've got our...
I actually don't think the create indexes one is in there.
Okay, let
me pass it to you real quick.
Yeah, let me grab that.
But
what we saw when we created these indexes is it went to about 10 seconds on average. So it went from about 6 minutes where we'd often see timeouts. Okay, let me copy that. To about 10 seconds on average once we had these custom indexes on. So if I execute this, dash, create these indexes, copy this, and let's just try to run this again and see what we get. Now, while we're waiting for this to run over here, we'll jump over to a lab that does have the indexes created. So if I come in and query my susdb, go ahead and execute search all updates. Now, one thing to mention, this is running against the entire scope of updates within this environment. So when ConfigMan, the WSync Manager component, actually pulls in updates from WSUS, it may use some of the filter criteria, which I think we have an example in our GitHub of what that can look like. But for example, you can see this one took four seconds to run against our entire database in ConfigMan. Let's see if yeah, so here we go. So this was the exact same environment that we just ran the query against that took 6 minutes. And what we can see is the only thing that we changed is the custom index that maps that superseded relationship and the metadata to make those queries look up in the stored procedure. We can see that we went to 6 seconds from about 6 minutes for those timeouts. So what will happen now is, we can see back over on demo 2, this is the one that actually timed out. So if I were to go and run this same query to create those indexes and run another sync, what we'll actually see is this will resolve that issue. And then our software update point will actually sync successfully. So go ahead and do a quick sync.
And at that point,
indexes.
It's kind of fixing itself after that, right? It's going to now decline superseded updates. It's going to expire old ones. It's probably going to do a decent job of cleanup, right? Because I know there's been a lot of community solutions and they're awesome and they really still do have use cases. But at the end of the day, the built-in stuff, when it's on and working, is also pretty dang effective. Once those indexes are in place and once you're getting rid of your superseded updates and maybe you have the retention set to a reasonable number like 3 or something and not 99, or maybe you've got it set to immediate, it'll be in decent shape, especially with the introduction of all the cumulatives over time. And if you do uncheck some old products, maybe you do need to get hyper specific. I know there's been some chat going on. Maybe you do want to remove x86, you want to remove Itanium, you want to remove by title. There are some tools to do that. It's totally valid. But how far do you need to go? What do you want to maintain? Are you building the implementation of that automation? Does your company even allow it? Do you have to write something yourself? There's a lot of factors. But the bare minimum here is absolutely helpful.
Yeah, so here's an example. This was right before those indexes. We then created it, and now we can see the sync was able to pull all the updates in. And at this point, it would start syncing the updates from WSUS to Config Manager. And another thing to call out, just by creating those indexes, we actually didn't even change the memory limit. So we're still on a super low amount, but just having those relationships and those custom indexes, we're still able to sync. And this is actually the query that took about 10 hours to run. We still had that limited to only 1 gig in SQL, but we just created those indexes was the only difference. Okay, I think I already looked at the client side impact. I think this is going over to you, Cody.
Yeah, I think you showed the screenshot. So yeah, awesome. So IIS configuration, this one comes up. It's like in every article ever. It's in the MS Docs, but I thought it's still a good one to bring up. So yeah, the defaults are not great. They're not. It's IIS. At the end of the day, WSUS runs on IIS, and there's some default settings that get set. And unfortunately, right, we've got that set it and forget it mentality. WSUS gets set up. IIS doesn't get touched. So I can mention the recommended settings. These are like not prescriptive. They're just recommendations. But I think what's more interesting is let's talk about them a little bit. So queue length, right? How many actual connections can get queued up? Well, and what happens? So it defaults to, I think, 1,000. The MS Docs say, hey, bump it up to 2,000. But what it boils down to, I think, is what you want to do is build that out for your environment, right? And when that limit is reached, when you have 2,000 clients, if you bumped it, fitting in queue, additional clients start getting a 503, right? And you'll probably seen that if you've dealt with WSUS in the past, you start getting 503s. So how does that happen? Well, it's when clients are taking too long to scan, right? When your clients are starting to choke because you've got too many updates, because maybe they failed and timed out and then they had to do a full scan, and then it's a domino effect. So you up the queue a little bit, you let a few more people in the line, maybe give them a little more time. And then the next bit is the idle timeout. It says, hey, just put it to 0. Well, what does it actually do? If your IIS pool just sits there for 20 minutes, it just stops the thread, right? And it'll just start a new one the next time someone requests. Just keep it active, right? It's hopefully a dedicated WSUS box. Just keep it going. Ping enabled. You always just like, oh yeah, sure, turn off ping. Well, it's not ICMP ping. That's not what it's talking about. It's something else. There's actually a like IIS component that like checks the app pool, and it periodically says, hey, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And so if it fails, it actually cycles the app pool. Well, what happens when you cycle the app pool and clients are scanning? It causes a failed scan. all of those clients that failed scanning will go back and do a full scan. All of a sudden, your queue length starts going back up. All of a sudden, you get 503s, failed scans, vicious cycle. So ping enable false. If it's going to die, let it die a different way, not from something as silly as an IIS ping. Again, it's not ICMP. It's an internal process. Private memory limit. They say dump it to 0. This is very contextual. Maybe, you've only got X amount of RAM on the box. Maybe it's sharing some other resources. But that's the default. It's not a lot. It can cause problems. Just be mindful of what else is on the server. And then one of the last ones here, regular time interval. What the heck does that mean? They say just put it to 0. So what that actually does is at the time interval specified, it actually will cycle the app pool. By default, it's 1,740 minutes. It's 29 hours. So every 29 hours, the IIS app pool will cycle. So change it to 0. Just let it run. WSUS is probably pretty busy. Just let it do its thing.
Cool. Yeah, and then I think last up, what we had is just kind of debugging, like how did we find, what WSUS was doing and how ConfigMan was calling these stored procedures. So just a good tool to have in your back pocket is SQL Profiler. Did we have a specific demo where we thought this would be the best scenario to do it on, Cody?
Anywhere you've got Profiler. I don't think so. I think we were just gonna probably kick off async. I mean, they're all gonna be super chatty in SQL Server Profiler.
Okay, let's go to demo 1.
So you can do a lot of really super awesome things with SQL Server Profiler. But realistically, we're just going to say hey, here it is, right? And here's some basic column level filters and look what we found. This is a tool that can do a lot of awesome stuff and provide you an insane amount of data. In some cases, right, you're going to it's like the CAT scan of medicine in some ways where you're just like, what is this? What's going on? What's broke? Lots of things happen in SQL. So we're just unchecking some audit stuff. Probably want to leave the stored procedure one maybe. Or are you just in the SQL? And then in the bottom right, there is a column filters. And within here, you can select the column on the left, and then you can expand this, and we can just put %WSUS%. It uses wildcards. I think it's percents. And then also probably WSync, right? So you could do %WSync % as well. So hit enter. It's kind of goofy.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Uh-oh. Justin must have got a new keyboard or something. And then you can exclude rows that don't contain values if you want, just to clean things up a little bit. Yeah, so I mean, at this point, right, it's just going to be in there. You can click run. And then if we kick off a sync, you're going to see an insane amount of back and forth chatty stuff happening. And you're going to wonder why the heck is it doing all this stuff repetitively over and over and over. But if you keep an eye on it and you start to look back through, check log files, we'll start correlating, when did it actually say doing the sync? When did it say starting cleanup, right? Check those timestamps. Start to correlate them back to the SQL Server Profiler. And then we can see when something happened, such as our exec SP search updates, right? We'll be able to actually kind of see where that happens. So we can see it's synchronizing categories. Give you search for SP. Yep, that should find. You might have to search previous if it's even to that point yet.
Yep.
There's event history, not that one. I think it's still doing categories. We're going to have to wait for the 2 minutes. Oh, man. I don't know if it's that interesting.
Yeah, I think we're probably good here, but I think the key thing is when we were trying to troubleshoot, what caused this timeout when ConfigMan was trying to sync. We weren't really sure what that WSync manager component, kind of the config manager side over here, WSync manager.log, what was that actually doing in SQL that was causing the timeout? So what we could see is it was actually calling a WSUS stored procedure, the search all updates, and that's how it determines based on the categories that you have enabled in your software update point, how it should query the updates in WSUS, and that's where we were seeing that timeout occur after 150 seconds based on the custom indexes not being made. So that's really the only thing I think that's worth mentioning as far as the profiler goes. That's where we we're really able to dig in and see what was actually causing those timeouts. So it can be a good tool if you're ever kind of troubleshooting deeper SQL issues. Cool, but I think that is it. So any questions we have at this point before Kent is up to speak?
I did see somebody ask if the queries will be shared. So we do have a public GitHub for vSmug. We'll make sure that the PowerPoint presentations are shared. We will make sure that any queries that we've ran to show this information in the database will be shared as well. So like I said 10, it's kind of like 10 question mark, right? We could probably fudge counting IIS configs and told you we gave you 10 tips. But definitely some interesting things. I think, yeah, Brian asked us an awesome question too. We learned something and we'll make a change.
Cool, but I think probably the big key takeaway is those checkboxes in the console basically had us go from getting support cases quite a bit because of WSUS timeouts to literally having not a single customer in their last sync do any timeouts at all. So definitely a key thing, and then just be aware of some of the limitations. Like if you're using WID and it's remote, some of those indexes may not be automatically created because it doesn't have access. And if you're using standalone WSUS, that's going to be a scenario where you have to go create those indexes using those scripts. We'll also include in the GitHub post, we'll include another guide that we have that kind of simplifies all this into a simple post. And it also links out to some of the Microsoft docs that goes over a lot of these different scenarios as well. So hopefully this was helpful. Kent, are you guys on the line?